Hi, I'm Luminousz Ztarr and welcome to the Luminousz Ztarr channel. All of my current subscribers, thank you guys and gals so much for being my stars, and special shout out to all of my stars who are parents, all of my Mr. Moms and all of my moms who are stars. Happy Mother's Day to you. I certainly hope your day is going well. Today's video, the grooming process of narcissistic parents. I'm going to be going over a few points, a few tools, but first, let's look at the topics of discussion. Topic number 1, the psychological effects of verbal abuse by narcissistic parents. The emotional aftermath of verbal abuse by narcissistic parents. The mental effects of verbal abuse. Next topic, examples of mental and emotional illness. Last but not least, the tools, the references, and the resources of which you will find in the description box below. Please don't forget to like and or share today's video. I also want to welcome everyone who's visiting Luminousz Ztarr for the first time. Should you decide to become one of our stars, please select the notification bell. That way, every video that comes out, you will be the first to know. Welcome to Luminousz Ztarr. First point, verbal abuse can often be used in the grooming process of narcissistic parents in order to dominate their children by physically abusing them. The role of parent within a dysfunctional family is misused by narcissistic parents by various methods, such as grooming their children to narcissistically supply him or her, while emotionally manipulating their children to play dysfunctional roles, to be a scapegoated child or a golden child. So there's a couple of things going on here. First, the narcissistic parent or parents are misusing their roles within a dysfunctional family dynamic. Okay, so while they have a dysfunctional family to pretty much use as a playground for narcissistic supply, the other thing that's going on is that they are emotionally bullying their children to either become a scapegoated child or a golden child. And all of this is designed to ensure that they receive narcissistic supply. So verbal abuse often is part of the grooming process in order for narcissistic parents to dominate the children. This usually happens before they physically abuse them. Sometimes it's simultaneously. They will use verbal abuse while physically abusing the child, and sometimes they use the verbal abuse, as I stated, as a grooming process to set them up for physical abuse. Okay, either way is a vicious cycle, all designed for the narcissistic supply of the narcissistic parents. Let's move forward. The damaging effects usually stem anywhere from a lack of self-esteem to having difficulty investing in healthy relationships with others due to addiction, obsession, and dysfunctional behavior. The predatory nature of narcissistic parents shapes their behavior, which tends to be dysfunctional and very toxic. So again, this is a vicious cycle within a dysfunctional family dynamic, whereas the narcissistic parents, what they're doing is ensuring possibly a lifelong narcissistic supply. So unfortunately, this has been the case. And on the other side of that, there are some adult children of narcissistic parents who wake up and realize that, hey, this is not how I want to live my life. I don't want to continue to narcissistically supply my parents. So on one hand, you're still being a parent to your narcissistic parents, and then you have your own children. So it's like you haven't stopped playing that dysfunctional role, and that is to parent your narcissistic parents. Okay, so some narcissistic parents, they set their children up for failure very early in life simply by emotionally manipulating him or her to parent them. All the while, they're verbally abusing them. The narcissistic parents are using verbal abuse. Sometimes as they become elderly, the verbal abuse increases. Okay, this is very interesting how this happens, but it often does. Narcissistic parents, they start very early trying to obtain the narcissistic supply from their own children. So as the children grow up into adults, they're not going to stop trying to get the supply from him or her. Actually, from a strong sense of entitlement, they're going to demand it. They're going to look at their adult child as, yes, you're still my property. Therefore, you need to serve up that narcissistic supply whenever I like. Okay, this is how the narcissistic parents usually see it as they become of age. when they are elderly, then they're not going to mellow out. Sometimes their diabolical tactics for narcissistic supply increase, believe it or not. Some people think that as a person becomes an elderly, they're harmless. When you're talking about a narcissistic parent, it's not wise to underestimate them. So just because they're up in age or they're elderly or they're seasoned, this does not mean they're going to mellow out. The diabolical tactics for narcissistic supply usually increase. Let's move on. Whether intentional or not, narcissistic parents verbally abuse their children as part of the grooming process in order to ultimately control him or her. Narcissistic parents realize that once they control their child's mind, the child will sacrifice themselves for them. So unfortunately, this is a vicious cycle, whereas the child is groomed very early. Okay, sometimes seemingly right out of the womb, the child is being groomed to narcissistically supply the parents or parent. Okay, so that child is going to be very familiar with that. So as he or she becomes an adult child of a narcissist, he or she may wake up and sometimes they may not. As long as that adult child of a narcissistic parent is within the sunken place, 9 times out of 10 chances, they're going to continue to play out that particular programming from the subconscious mind that says they will be under control of their parents, even though they might be 18, they might be 25 years old, they might be 45, and they're still under the narcissistic parents' spell. They're still up under their control. They're still being dominated by the narcissistic parents, regardless if they have their children or their spouse or not. Okay, so this is an adult child of a narcissistic parent that may be an adult with their own children and their own marriage, right, their own spouse, but they're still being dominated by the narcissistic parent. Narcissistic parents often do not let up on the verbal abuse, and all of this is designed to control their adult child. Okay, this is all for control, and as long as they can control their minds, then the adult child of the narcissistic parent will continue to be dominated, and they will sacrifice themselves. Not only that, but the real twisted and cold part is that sometimes the adult child of a narcissist thinks that he or she came up with the concept themselves. All the things that they do to narcissistically supply their parents, they often think that it is of their own idea. They don't realize that they are being controlled by the narcissistic parent, even at the age of, say, 30. They don't realize it. And all of this can stem from verbal abuse. Some people, unfortunately, are underestimating the effects of verbal abuse, whereas verbal abuse can overshadow the adult child of the narcissist for a very long time. And again, just stemming from the verbal abuse, we hadn't even gotten to the other diabolical tactics from narcissistic parents to obtain narcissistic supply. So as long as the adult child of the narcissist is within the sunken place, they can be controlled just by verbal abuse by their narcissistic parents. Let's move on. Many children naturally wish to have a deep, meaningful connection to his or her parents. Narcissistic parents go against what is natural, whereas it pertains to parent-child relationships. Narcissistic parents are dedicated to feeding their false self-image to keep it thriving, rather than committing to investing emotionally in balancing a healthy, loving, and purposeful parent-child relationship with their children to ensure their well-being. Now, I know that was a mouthful, okay? So let's get into it. Narcissistic parents are dedicated to their false self-image, thriving and surviving. So in order to keep that false self-image fed, they will commit to doing that via diabolical tactics for narcissistic supply from their children. So the children, naturally, they want to be connected to mommy and daddy, right? But mommy and daddy, who are narcissistic or they have a cluster personality, they're dedicated only to their false self-image. See, they will nurse the false self-image before they nurse their own children. So most of us already know from experience that narcissistic parents find it more important to keep the false self-image thriving and surviving, therefore alive. Okay, that they will nurse the false self-image much more carefully and with much more care than their own children. And this is a hard pill to swallow, but a lot of us have swallowed it. And by swallowing that particular pill, a lot of us have become more aware to other things that really needed our attention. You know, the clues were there all along. So many adult children of narcissistic parents, they may still naturally wish to have that deep, meaningful connection to their narcissistic parents. However, narcissistic parents, right from the beginning, have shown signs of not caring for that same deep connection with their children. So the love and the care and the nourishment is not being reciprocated at all. So it's very much a one-sided relationship, and it's usually very toxic, very painful, and as I stated before, the verbal abuse continues to run rampant. Let's move forward. Children are often seen by narcissistic parents as property to be used for a lifelong primary narcissistic supply. Trust has been violated, betrayal has occurred, while emotional, if not physical, abandonment has taken place. The emotional development of children is seriously arrested, if not retarded, in a very significant way. So there's arrested development here when it pertains to the narcissistic parents and how they relate to their children or their child. So unfortunately, due to verbal abuse, arrested development can occur. The children are often seen by the narcissistic parents as property. And as I stated before, they look at them as a possible lifelong primary narcissistic supply. And that view rarely changes. Earlier, I mentioned how some narcissistic parents, as they begin to age or season or become elderly, their verbal abuse does not cease. It increases. And sometimes that's due to fear. That's due to fear. Because a lot of narcissists, they operate from a place of fear anyway. It doesn't always show, but usually they operate from a place of fear. When they have to manipulate other people to supply them narcissistically, that's operating from a place of fear, because they are afraid that if those individuals really knew who they were and what they represent, no one would want to be around him or her, and they would be correct. So when you think about it, a lot of narcissists do operate and function from a place of fear, not love. So if a narcissistic parent or narcissistic parents are viewing their adult children as property in their elderly years, then the verbal abuse will more than likely increase, not decrease, simply because the narcissistic parent or parents, they're trying to maintain control. They're operating from a place of fear. One of the effects of verbal abuse, as I stated, is arrested development in the emotional state of children. So the narcissistic parents, they're damaging their children emotionally. There's a risk that the child may suffer from emotional illness because there's the arrested development in that area due to verbal abuse from the narcissistic parents. Unfortunately, sometimes this does happen. This does not always happen. However, in a lot of cases, this is what happens. So one of the adverse effects of verbal abuse is emotional illness. Not all the time, but is possible. Next point. Adult children of narcissistic parents are often plagued by flashbacks, nightmares, and very painful memories of his or her narcissistic parents long after leaving the dysfunctional family. There is always a possibility of passing on the dysfunctional family legacy to the next generation due to emotional and or mental illness as a result of verbal abuse by narcissistic parents. Some children of narcissistic parents, they grow up to be the golden child, or they also develop a cluster B, if not a narcissistic personality. Sometimes they're pegged as or tagged as the scapegoated child. In each situation, there is the possibility of passing on the dysfunctional family legacy. Oftentimes, you will find at the root of this childhood trauma, and clustered from that, you will find mental and or emotional illness, all resulting from verbal abuse by the narcissistic parents. So as you can see, this is a vicious cycle. You have the child who's been affected by narcissistic abuse at the hands of their parents. As the children grow up, becoming adult children of narcissistic parents, sometimes you will find that they have passed on the dysfunctional family legacy. And you will also find that they're dealing with mental, if not emotional, illness. Now, this is not to put anyone down. This is just stating facts here. All we have to do is do the research, and we will find the stats. Okay, the stats, the statistics, the records, whatever you want to call it. I usually don't like to use those types of words to talk about this, because all of us really, we can examine our own lives, and we can pretty much gather some information from that. There's nothing wrong with comparing the information outside of our lives, but I'm telling you, life is a great teacher. Experience is a great teacher. So all one has to do is really look at their own lives, and they can relate to pretty much what I'm saying here. The bottom line is, all of us are affected to a certain degree by how we were raised. All of the messages that we received, all of the principles that were encouraged by our parents to be applied to our lives as adults. Our parents learned particular principles. They passed them on to us. So whether we like it or not, whether we agree with this or whether we admit it or not, to a certain degree, we are all affected by how we grew up and the principles that our parents encouraged us to apply to our lives. So this is what I'm saying here in this particular point. By passing on the family legacy, the dysfunctional family legacy, often you will find emotional and or mental illness as part of the root, as well as the childhood trauma. You're going to find those things more than likely. This is not to suggest that every family is like this. This is not to suggest that every parent is doing this intentionally. We're talking about narcissistic parents here. We're not talking about every type of parent. We're talking about the narcissistic parents and the parents who have a cluster B personality. Some children, when they grow up into adult children of narcissistic parents, they still are plagued by flashbacks and nightmares of very painful memories. So when you add all of this up, when they start to pass this on, what do you think is going to happen? It's not very hard to see how narcissistic parents continue to control their adult children by verbal abuse. All they have to do is say certain key words, and it may trigger their adult child emotionally, if not mentally. Let's move forward. Examples of emotional and mental illness. Lack of empathy, having an inability to emotionally regulate. Now, these are examples of emotional illness. Examples of mental illness: irrational and or overwhelming fears, anxiety disorders. Now, if we look closer at this, we can identify which characteristic is that of the narcissist, or characteristics is that of the narcissist, and the cluster B personality. Lacking empathy, that falls right up under emotional illness. You notice it's not up under mental illness. So this is, I've done a couple of videos about how a lot of narcissists and those with a cluster B personality, if they had a chief complaint and went to the doctor, it could very well be emotional illness, not mental illness. Some people do debate that, and I understand. It's all about the person's experience, and it's also about their perspective, as well as their own research and information and knowledge on this subject. So emotional illness and mental illness, of course, they're not really the same. There's some similarities, but there's some differences as well. But just by looking at these examples, we can see where the narcissist falls. And they're falling more so on the side of emotional illness rather than mental illness. When it comes to the narcissists and cluster B personalities, yes, some of them do have anxiety. Some of them do have irrational and or overwhelming fears, which goes right into the state of anxiety. When it comes to the emotional illness, though, a big one is that they lack empathy and they are not able to emotionally regulate. So in conclusion, both mental and emotional illness can be found in the cluster B personality and or narcissistic personality. It's best to look at your own experiences. There are circumstances that vary. There are situations that vary. Some narcissistically abusive people, they are more mentally ill than emotionally ill. Some of them are more emotionally ill than mentally ill. Okay, because it can go back and forth, or it can fluctuate. Sometimes when they age, for example, narcissistic parents, as they age, they may become more mentally ill rather than emotionally ill. So when they were younger, they showed more signs of being emotionally ill, which is another reason why some of them went up under the radar, or they went stealth when it came to counselors and doctors and therapists. But as they age, it may become more apparent that they have an emotional illness. Some narcissists, as they age, they began to show more signs of having a mental illness rather than an emotional illness. It's not that they don't have symptoms of emotional illness, it's just that the mental illness symptoms tend to override the emotional illness symptoms. So every circumstance is not the same, and every situation is not the same. And after you do some research, you can compare and say, okay, well, this particular narcissist that I know, they have more of an emotional illness rather than a mental illness, or vice versa. But I just want to suggest doing your own research and comparing it to your own experiences. I want to suggest to everyone watching, especially my stars, please don't attempt to diagnose anyone with a mental illness or an emotional illness, or even a cluster B personality or narcissistic personality disorder. I say don't do that because sometimes we can miss the mark. We're dealing with someone and they may not even have a cluster B personality. We're dealing with someone that is very unpleasant, and it may turn out that they don't have a narcissistic personality at all. They may not have a cluster B personality. They may have a mental illness. They may have an emotional illness, or the combination of the two. Every person that you know for certain that has a cluster B personality, they do not necessarily have a narcissistic personality. Every narcissist that you know for certain has been diagnosed with narcissistic personality, I can guarantee you that they have a cluster B personality. Stemming from a cluster B personality is a narcissistic personality, because narcissistic personality, according to the DSM-5, is a symptom of cluster B personality and not the other way around. This is also why I state here with the emotional illness and the mental illness, some cluster B personalities and some narcissists, they have both, and sometimes they have one or the other. Next point. There are some children who may begin by adolescence to display signs of verbal abuse, childhood trauma, and neglect, which stems from the subconscious mind program that he or she runs. The subconscious mind is heavily influenced by parents while children are growing up. The subconscious mind program that is downloaded into the child's subconscious mind by narcissistic parents more than likely will be very debilitating to the child, while narcissistic parents may find it more beneficial. The subconscious mind, according to my own research, is very powerful. It's absolutely our friend. It protects us from a lot of things that are very traumatic and painful. However, a lot of us don't understand how the subconscious mind functions. So I just want to suggest to everyone watching and listening, please do some research on the subconscious mind. There are a lot of narcissistic parents during the grooming process via verbal abuse. They're downloading particular subconscious mind programs into the child. Okay, so the child will run that program as he or she becomes an adult. This is often why a lot of narcissistic parents continue long after that child turns 18 to control the adult child until that adult child, the narcissistic parent, wakes up and realizes that they don't have to live that way. They don't have to be controlled. They don't have to continue for all of their life to narcissistically supply their parents. So this is why this is very debilitating to the child, while the narcissistic parent benefits, because the narcissistic parent's aim is to make sure that their false self-image survives. Not so much that their child will survive and thrive, but their false self-image will survive and thrive. Let's move forward. The result of verbal abuse combined with the subconscious mind program can be the development of mental illnesses such as bipolar, anxiety, attention deficit, schizophrenia, autism, obsessive compulsive disorder, and clinical depression. Let's move forward. Trauma bonding often takes place when narcissistic parents misuse emotional feelings excitement, struggle, and sabotage to bind their children to him or her, all for the narcissistic supply. This is often why many adult children of narcissistic parents struggle to set themselves free of the aftermath of narcissistic abuse. Every aspect of their lives seems to be overshadowed by narcissistic abuse at the hands of his or her parents. Financially, spiritually, psychologically, sexually, emotionally, and physically, some are affected to the point of feeling trapped long after the beginning stages of adulthood. This is also why I stated that it is very challenging to overcome the adverse effects of narcissistic abuse. Once a person decides that they're going to thrive forward past narcissistic abuse, please understand they have to be dedicated, they have to be committed, and they have to have some discipline. Most of all, emotional discipline will probably be their best friend. So pardon me for digressing, but I just wanted to mention that because I think some people do not understand just how challenging it is just to say go no contact and then begin healing from that point on, because that person may have about 40 years of being narcissistically abused. They may have 30 years of it. They may have 20, however many years they have from experiencing narcissistic abuse. There's the aftermath of that. So once they begin to heal, it's going to take it's a process. It's going to take time. So I think some people just have a misconceived notion about narcissistic abuse and the aftermath of it. Tool number 1, assess and evaluate your childhood with narcissistic parents in order to constructively begin releasing and expressing yourself within a safe and stable environment. Seek wise counsel and trusting support for this tool. It is not uncommon to possibly become triggered by unpleasant memories of childhood. Should unpleasant emotions surface, remember that this is natural due to the ordeal that you survived. Resources. Wow, I certainly hope everyone has enjoyed that video, and thank you again, my stars especially, for joining me today or tonight. And wherever you may be right now, I wish you the very best love possible. A friendly reminder, every Sunday and every Thursday, there are new videos that are coming out. However, all of you who are just joined the Star family, welcome to the Luminousz Ztarr family, and don't forget to select the notification bell, so that way every Sunday, every Thursday, you'll be the first to know about those new videos coming out. I'm Luminousz Ztarr again. Thank you everyone for joining me today or tonight. Stay tuned for more vlogs and stay tuned for more videos.
through our lines